Hello, my name is Dr David Armstrong and welcome to the presentation. I'm going to talk you through how we can develop proactive and preventative interventions for children who experience behavioural difficulties, particularly children affected by autism. And if you wish to contact me, my email address is on the front there of the front sheet of the presentation. And please remember that you can stop or pause the presentation at any point to carry out some of the activities I will suggest. So let's talk about the objectives of this presentation, which are to talk about proactive interventions, to describe what they might be in an education setting for children with behavioural difficulties, particularly those connected with autism. I'm going to talk about how we can teach replacement behaviours for children who are, and those are behaviours which we use to replace the negative ones which we want to change. I'm going to talk about the issue of managing stress and anxiety and how that can impact on and should impact on how we think about supporting children with behavioural difficulties. I'm going to talk about the issue of physical arrangements in setting, the issue of safety for us and others around us, other students, and the issue of how we consider and record critical incidents connected to behaviour which are occurring in setting. I'm also going to talk about the importance of rules and routines. And remember, all of this is connected, is focused upon children who have autism, but will be of great use to your practice with a range of children with a disability, different forms of disability, and none even. So let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about the origins, the basis of interventions, which are that we need to understand the function, the purpose and outcomes of a child's behaviour. The best way to do this is to use an FBA, a functional behaviour assessment, one of the best ways, which I've covered in other presentations I've done, and I'm presuming that you have already done this. So you have defined a child's behaviour in detail, looking precisely at what they are, what the behaviour is, and you have identified factors relating to the behaviour using an ABC, that is antecedent, behaviour and consequences, ABC form, to think about when and where behaviour occurs, what persons or situations the behaviour occurs with, and what activities and times or contexts are related to the behaviour. So moving from that, you've identified the functions, outcomes for the behaviour, and gone on to develop a hypothesis statement about the purpose of behaviour. So what is the purpose of the behaviour? What's our guess? Remember, hypothesis being a best guess about something, which we're then going to go and test out our best guess by gathering and analysing data via a structured, detailed observation and by consultation with others to support what we're doing. So there's the process that needs to have happened really before we think about interventions, and that process is there to help us guide and be precise, have some precision to the interventions that we use, making it most likely that the ones that we use are the most appropriate ones, which will be the most effective with children who have behavioural challenges. So let's move on to thinking about proactive interventions, and these are ones where we think actively as a professional about what I can do realistically to change that behaviour. How can I, as a professional, modify or change the factors that contribute to that behaviour, environmental and other? And what can I do to teach the child to use as a replacement behaviour that addresses the same purpose or outcome? And these are flowing on from the idea that we can never destroy a child's need to have a particular behaviour. We can only direct that urge into a more positive form. that the child realises is more effective, and that for us is less negative and more helpful. And this is a small, quite often a series of very small changes and steps. We should be realistic in thinking about how this process can occur. So here's some of the real detail of that then. So thinking about can I teach the replacement behaviour to the individual? How will that be carried out? How can I make sure that I am not reinforcing the outcome of the challenging behaviour for a child? And thinking about their matching up what we're replacing a behaviour with that has been replaced in terms of from the child's perspective. So some of the key questions there. Into the real meat of it here, we have to think carefully about, as a professional, about what achievable replacement behaviour we can find, and think about how this will be attractive to the child in that it will get them their needs more easily, faster and more efficiently than the previous negative one we're replacing. And part of this, of course, one potential criticism or limitation, I guess, of this process, or at least a critical thought, is that to undertake this, we need to be able to communicate with the child, and understand them too, and help them understand us, of course, and most of that is, of course, through verbal interaction, through receptive and expressive language. So that's one of the challenges that children with autism and a range of other disabilities often have. So we need to think about, as we're doing this, the process of changing behaviour, helping a child change their behaviours, being able to communicate more effectively, or as effectively as we can, with them, and then being able to understand our intentions to some extent, and being able to understand their own purpose and communicate their own purpose. Indeed, communication, difficulties and obstacles with communication can be one of the main reasons why children have behaviours which we think are perceived as negative. Remembering that they may be frustrated because they can't communicate what they want and their desires and needs, often very simple desires and needs: hunger, thirst, tiredness. So by helping them communicate that dual process, we are also helping this process of change occur. Here is something you might want to pause just to look more carefully at this, and getting down to some of the detail here of how we might document this out with a student. And here is a behaviour support plan summary, an example of one from www.autismclassroomnews.com, which talks about how, thinking they're already just discussed, what the specific prevention strategies are, what are the replacement skills we're wanting to teach, and how, here's a crucial bit, how we will respond, how we will communicate, and how the child will communicate to us, of course, that interaction, our response, respond back and forth to different possibilities when things are not quite working but are starting to perhaps work. So if Joe exhibits one of the target behaviours, staff will respond in a certain way. That's in the responding strategies column there. So the student here being described as Joe Blues. So here's a plan, a thinking through of this process, and a breaking down and a scheduling of this process, recording of this process. So here's one of the key challenges in this process: how to make sure that we're not reinforcing the challenging behaviour. And some questions we can ask ourselves here, and a really good, interesting case, a YouTube link there to a young man called Daniel, whose family talk about their early reinforcement of unwanted behaviours, of head banging actually in this case, and talk about how they are embarked on not teaching replacement behaviours. So there we go. So here's some more questions we need to think about. We need to decide in detail, as I said, what replacement behaviours We're going to teach and reinforce, and how we're going to reinforce those. One principle here is that we can ignore the difficult behaviour in this process, and of course reward. So we can ignore the challenging behaviour rather, and reward positive behaviours through this process in a careful way, of course. So here's an interesting example here by several parents who have children with autism, and about how they do that. And it's at breakfast time, so they're interesting to consider what replacement behaviours they've taught and how they reinforce positive behaviours here. So, some more principles. We need to plan for easy and early success for a student to develop their motivation. Again, this is often forgotten about with students who have disabilities. It's as though they don't have motivational factors like the rest of the student population sometimes. That's a perception that sometimes by teachers. That's just simply forgotten about, that they are motivated by things. We need to think about how we key that in, how we use those motivational things to help them change. We need to think about consistency across the setting and home, so that what's happening in setting is replicated at home and vice versa. There is connection, and that means a dialogue with parents, and often it may mean some negotiation around what's viable at home and also viable at school, so that there's consistency there. And Martin Handry's excellent book, Educating Students on the Autistic Spectrum, gives some examples there of this process at pages 50 to 54. We also need to be receptive, as I said earlier, to the child's communication. So in this early phase in particular, we need to be alert to what they're telling us about how they're changing their behaviour and any issues they're experiencing along the way. So extra vigilance there on just at the early parts of the process to establish this change, this positive change, bedded in. So here's some next steps so we can... That's exciting. So some next steps we can have, and here I would I encourage you to pause and think about an individual that you work with, and to carry out some of the steps I've just described with them, which are listed here. So a 15-minute short activity for you there. So, of course, here's a complicating factor. Here's something that we may not be able to influence as much as we would want to wish, and which is a major issue. The research on this suggests that it's a major issue for children with autism, a huge issue for them. Stress and anxiety is well documented as a complicating factor and a major cause of distress and misery for many children and young people and adults with autism. It is also a trigger for challenging behaviour. So again, thinking about how we tackle some of the root causes of negative behaviours, we need to think about how we can help a child tackle their own stress and anxiety if it is in fact an issue for them. Byron Cohen here gives a good example of the difficult impacts of anxiety, talking about cycles of anxiety that children are locked in, and fragmented thinking that result from that extreme arousal and the behaviours that are part of that. So there's been increasing efforts over the last 20 years really. Hattersley, Hambury, Moyes talk about this issue about how we can practically work with children affected by autism to reduce their anxiety. So we talked earlier about the importance of consistency between school and home. Part of that is talking to parents about having a firm bedtime, being calm and consistent, so that at school and also at home, using imagery to refocus anxious thoughts, working with children to help them to use that technique, go to their calm place. We talk about deep breathing, things like vigorous exercise can be useful for some children, relaxation, massage on hands. People like Tony Attwood have talked about a stress barometer, which is a little device, a simple device we use where children can just alert us to the level of stress they're feeling, which can be on their desk or in their drawer or whatever, somewhere if they're sat at a desk in a classroom, just to help us understand where they're at that day and be able to intervene and reduce their anxiety if we can. We can also, of course, but this needs to be done very carefully, use students' passions to interrupt cycles of stress if we see they are rising. And this is not an exhaustive list. I've said there anything else that we can do. And there's a nice image made by Art Paper about one of the techniques you can communicate with students, a visual technique, breathe, to help talk to children about the connection between breathing and stress, strategies they can use. So, okay, moving on. Of course, those are some simple, immediate strategies we can use, but it may be that we need a more comprehensive strategy here too, which will involve multi-professional input from people like psychiatrists, psychologists, clinicians, even a social worker involved in the student's life, who may have a good insight into some of the stresses on them and potentially on the family, and how we can work together with those professionals to address anxiety adversely affecting a child. So here's also, with all the students, cognitive behavioural strategies, so strategies they can teach themselves to understand their behaviours, could be useful here. And my own book, Armstrong et al. 2015, pages 113 to 116, is useful here. And here is discussing some of these cognitive behavioural strategies which we can use and giving examples of how we might use them. Remember, of course, that we can use these with a wide range of children too. So it could be children who are affected by autism who benefit from these, especially high functioning, as described, children with high function, HFA, or it could be children affected by a range of other disabilities. So these are good strategies to use with a wide range of children who have challenges around their behaviour. So let's consider markers here. Or alternatively, you can think about a child who has autism of the high functioning variety and who has faced negative life experiences. So we can go through the following procedure to this is an example of a cognitive behavioural strategy. By thinking about what rules for living do we suppose a child has, how we might get them to tackle those, to name those, and to tackle them, and to think about negative guides, internalised guides they have for their life, and patterns that trigger these unhelpful and negative thoughts, and how they might realise and be more aware of when these thoughts are emerging, and be able to therefore reduce the influence of these negative thoughts, and even over the long term to tackle the basis of some of these unhelpful, what I describe as rules, Hanel rules for living. So you can consult Armstrong et al. 113 to 116 there for more detail. The book Understanding Child and Adolescent Behaviour in the Classroom. For more detail there. So let's move on to physical arrangements and policy. And we've talked about how our work with some of the preventative and proactive strategies which we can use with a child. But of course, there's a wider cultural and institutional background to all of this. Research in the area by Espelage et al. In the US have suggested that teachers' experience of violence in their settings from children who have challenging behaviours is surprisingly under-researched. So there's an activity here for you to think about your own practice, your own setting, and think about working with somebody else from your setting. Some key questions here about how you respond to challenging behaviours, particularly talking about policy and how policy is applied in setting. So I'll leave you to, if you pause this and work through with a colleague these 3 questions here, and I'll move on. And here's some more questions for you to work through in your activity with a colleague. So, presuming that you've done that activity, here is an example of a local one, publicly available one from the Department for Education and Child Development in South Australia, one that's used here, the DCD, a notifiable incident report, in which a notifiable, i.e. serious incident, is recorded. This is a form that's publicly available from them. Note that there are affected person, type of incident, and there are details here at the top for contact details here. But there are, as well as form filling, form completion, there are procedures and principles, I should say, which we can follow to think about how we can have effective and high quality procedures in setting. And here is one from Western Australia, from Government of Western Australia, which talks about how we can think about prevention and mitigation, how we can prevent or reduce the impact of challenging behaviours or serious behavioural incidences, how we can be better prepared if a serious incident involving behaviour does occur, how we can better respond to an incident, a critical incident, thinking about who responds and how is policy applied in practice, how can we get back to recover from the incident, thinking about us as well, of course, the professionals who've been involved in the incident, staff who've been involved, but also, of course, the peers, the children, the students in setting. How can we get learning back on track and things back to normal? How we can record what happens in the incident, and remember that some of this could be related to a functional behaviour assessment in terms of thinking about how we can reduce, how we can tackle some of these unwanted behaviours, and to putting in place a positive behavioural support plan, and how we can, in a cyclical operation, we can review our procedures to say, are they working, are they not, where could they be improved, what are the next things we can do, particularly after a major incident, to check that the procedures that we have in setting are effective, and look at preventing, best responding to, and recovery from serious incidents. So there's a process there that you could think about in terms of your own setting and the policy that you have, where you are. So, moving on to more mundane things, but still interesting. We can also think, and of course there's been much written about this, the physical arrangements in classrooms, thinking particularly talking about quiet versus active areas and how this impacts on children, and of course thinking about how we can monitor some of the quieter areas in terms of safety to ensure that everybody's safe, and to check that some of the challenging behaviours are not building up and not developing and in other children. We can also think about building independence in classrooms, having spaces where children under a watchful eye, but can have a chance to behave well, to be positive and independent in their learning and in their behaviour. And we need to scaffold that and have spaces where they can practice out those skills. That's really important. Think about a density of areas. So what are the implications of this, particularly for thinking about stress and arousal, If an area is overdense, there's too much going on in an area, how is that going to impact on a child's anxiety? Is that going to be a trigger for stress, which is then a trigger for unwanted behaviours? Thinking about, of course, the physical boundaries, and there are physical constraints in classrooms. An interesting area of research, that one, how classrooms have changed over the last 20 to 30 years in terms of the space available to teachers. And think, of course, mundane things again about seating arrangements and materials, and how we can use materials that are safe but engaging, and also how we can, particularly with children who have autism, reduce visual and sensory overload in our physical layout. To help us do this, we can draw a map of our classroom and look at targeting classroom areas where problem behaviours occur, and this could even be used actually as supporting evidence for a functional behaviour assessment, where we think about the antecedents, the triggers for behaviours, and also in supporting our hypothesis statement in thinking about the causes of particular behaviours. This could be helpful in clarifying exactly what the antecedents are for negative behaviours, so we can reorganise our classroom to minimise some of these environmental triggers. And there's a little bit of discussion there for you. And of course, it's worth saying, just as a recap, really, for everybody, research in the area by Gable and publications by people like Peter Westwood have talked about how we should have classroom rules and routines, and how this is really important in giving children structure, in understanding how they should be in a classroom. All children, that is, under inclusive principles, but this will particularly benefit children with disabilities. And if to include children with disabilities, our rules should be few, should be concise, i.e. short, should be positive, and should be posted clearly up in the classroom with clear consequences, positive and negative, for keeping within these behavioural boundaries, and how our application of them, of course, should be consistent and fair. Now, of course, I have been I was a teacher for quite a few years, so I understand that these are aspirational sometimes, but in terms of the application of consistent application all the time is a goal we need. It can be a challenging goal to meet, but we need to head towards that goal. But the other points, I think, are achievable in terms of having few, concise, positive and posted rules and routines in the classroom. And the other point, of course, at the end is that we need to review these again, and the cyclical process of ensuring that what we do is effective and the best it can be, and to adjust it if necessary. Some of the other thing, one other strategy moving on that we can use that applies to the real fine grain of classroom practice, is we can teach children with disabilities, particularly autism, children affected by autism, but also children affected by a range of other difficulties such as intellectual disability will also benefit from this. We can teach specific procedures connected to the clear behaviours. I'll just go back for a second about I spoke a moment ago about. So when we think about classroom routines, we can break that down further and into procedures. So here's an activity you can do yourself to break down the procedure in your classroom of, for example, putting belongings away, or getting quiet, or tidying up, or leaving the room. So think about that as an activity, as an event, but then break that down into subparts. And these things we can teach children affected by developmental disabilities, or who struggle in these areas, teach them to understand and be able to themselves be able to break down and break down these behaviours into procedures, and that can be helpful. So with older children, those less severely affected by disabilities or who are high functioning, as the term is used, we can also teach schedules which are essentially time plans for particular activities, and which can be useful for children, for them to understand to anticipate change and to understand what's coming next. And when they can anticipate change and understand what's coming next, for many children that can reduce their anxiety and lead to less moments where they feel overwhelmed and anxious with the attendant behaviours that we want to reduce. So these can be helpful. And here's an example of one schedule to do with swimming. Now it's a short example, and you may wish to practice this yourself and replicate this with thinking about a child that you know and how this might be helpful. And here's just an illustration here. So I hope that has been useful for you, and I've talked you through very briefly some of the key issues in this area, thinking about how we can be proactive in our interventions, thinking about how we can teach replacement behaviours and the issues around that, thinking about how we can use an FBA to inform our interventions, thinking about how we can consider stress and anxiety and reducing that, how we can think about teaching children to understand and be able to better respond to their own negative feelings and emotions, and in the longer term thinking about reducing the rules for living, any negative rules they have for themselves. I've also talked about some of the policy implications of challenging behaviour and talked you through talked about critical incidents and how we record those in setting and some of the process there, thinking about mitigating, reducing and anticipating these incidents, how we can look at the real detail of how we apply those incidents, how we focus on those incidents, thinking about how, and of course how we recover from those incidents. So I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I hope this has been helpful. If you wish to have more information and advice, there's much more in my book, Understanding Child and Adolescent Behaviour, with my colleagues there. All the best, and thank you again for listening. Cheers.